Hey everyone, welcome to Geopolitical Puzzles. I'm Alex, and with me as always is my curious co-host, Rowan.
Hey there, I'm excited about today's topic, Alex. Though I have to admit, when you first mentioned it, I thought we were diving into some kind of historical footnote.
Oh, it's anything but. We're exploring a fascinating theory that's been shaping world politics for over a century. Imagine having a map that could predict where the next global powerhouse would emerge. That's exactly what a Victorian geographer named Halford Mackinder claimed to have figured out.
Wait, you're telling me someone from 1904 created a theory that's still relevant today?
Absolutely. It's called the Heartland theory, and it suggests that whoever controls certain key regions of Eurasia could potentially dominate the entire world. And here's the kicker. It's still influencing everything from the conflict in Ukraine to China's massive Belt and Road Initiative.
So we're not just talking about dusty old maps and theories then?
Not at all. We'll explore how this seemingly simple idea about geographical control has shaped modern geopolitics, why it matters for today's global conflicts, and how it might even predict future power struggles.
I can already tell our listeners are in for quite a journey. Where do we start?
Let's begin with the brilliant but controversial mind behind it all, Sir Halford Mackinder himself. Let me take you back to London, 1904. Picture this. A distinguished British geographer steps up to the podium at the Royal Geographical Society. He's about to present a paper that would completely transform how we think about global power.
I'm guessing this is our friend Mackinder?
Exactly right. And what made his presentation so groundbreaking was that it challenged everything the British Empire believed about power at the time. You see, Britain had built its empire on naval supremacy, controlling the seas and major trade routes.
Makes sense, given that Britain was an island nation.
Right. But Mackinder looked at the rapid development of railways across Eurasia and saw something that others missed. He realized that land power might actually become more important than sea power in the 20th century.
That's quite a claim to make in front of the British Empire's top brass.
It certainly was. In his paper, The Geographical Pivot of History, Mackinder argued that technological changes were making inland regions more accessible and more important than ever before. He essentially told the British Empire that their naval strategy might become outdated.
I can imagine that went down well. But what exactly did he mean by the Heartland? Was it just railways?
No, it was much more comprehensive than that. Mackinder identified a vast region stretching from Eastern Europe across Central Asia that he called the Heartland. He saw this area as virtually impregnable to naval powers and rich in resources.
So basically he was saying, whoever controls this region controls everything?
Well, he put it even more dramatically. He created what became known as Mackinder's Dictum. Who rules East Europe commands the Heartland. Who rules the Heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world.
The world island? That's a term I haven't heard before.
That was Mackinder's name for the combined continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa. He saw them as one massive interconnected landmass that contained most of the world's resources and population.
And this was revolutionary because
it completely flipped the script on naval power. Britain had always assumed that controlling the seas was the key to global power. But Mackinder suggested that a land-based power could potentially bypass maritime trade routes altogether by using railways and controlling this central region.
I'm starting to see why this wasn't just another academic paper. This was basically telling the British Empire their whole strategy might be wrong.
Exactly, and here's what's fascinating. Mackinder wasn't just theorizing. He was watching the rapid industrialization of Germany and Russia, and he was deeply concerned about how this might affect British power.
So he was really trying to warn them?
Yes, and his timing was significant. The British Empire was already showing signs of decline, and new powers were emerging. Mackinder saw that the world was changing, and he was trying to help Britain adapt to this new reality.
It's amazing how he could see these patterns emerging. But was anyone actually listening?
Initially, many dismissed his ideas as too theoretical. But here's the ironic part. While the British may have been skeptical, his theory found a much more receptive audience in Germany and later in other continental powers.
You mean the very powers he was warning about?
Precisely. And that's what makes this story so fascinating. Mackinder's attempt to alert Britain to potential threats ended up providing a theoretical framework that would be used by the very powers he was concerned about.
Talk about unintended consequences.
Indeed. And speaking of consequences, the way his theory influenced the strategies of various powers throughout the 20th century is a whole other fascinating chapter of this story. You know what's fascinating about Mackinder's Heartland? It wasn't just the strategic location that made it important. The region he identified sits on an absolutely incredible wealth of natural resources.
Really? I mean, I know it's a huge area, but just how resource-rich are we talking about?
Well, today this region contains about 50% of the world's known natural resources. We're talking about vast reserves of oil, natural gas, rare earth minerals, pretty much everything a modern industrial economy needs.
50%? That's a lot more than I expected. No wonder it's so strategically important.
And here's what makes it even more significant. This region is home to 70% of the world's population. Just think about what that means in terms of both human capital and market potential.
So you're not just controlling resources, you're also controlling access to massive markets?
Exactly. And what's really interesting is how these resources are distributed. Take Central Asia, for instance. Kazakhstan alone has some of the world's largest deposits of uranium, chromium, lead, and zinc. Then you've got Turkmenistan's natural gas reserves.
Wait, I've got to ask, with all our modern technology, haven't we found ways around this? I mean, can't we just transport resources from anywhere to anywhere now?
That's a great question. While transportation has certainly improved, controlling the physical location of these resources still matters enormously. Think about recent events. Remember how everyone panicked when the Suez Canal was blocked in 2021?
Oh yeah, that one stuck ship caused chaos in global shipping.
Right. Now imagine controlling not just a canal, but the source of the resources themselves. Plus, there's another factor that Mackinder couldn't have predicted, but that makes his theory even more relevant today.
What's that?
Climate change. Many of these heartland regions, particularly in Siberia, are becoming more accessible and resource-rich as permafrost melts. We're talking about new agricultural lands, easier resource extraction, and new transportation routes.
So the heartland is actually becoming more valuable over time?
In many ways, yes. And there's another fascinating aspect. The region's agricultural potential. The Ukrainian steppes, for instance, have some of the world's most fertile soil. They don't call Ukraine the breadbasket of Europe for nothing.
I've heard about that. The Black Earth, right?
Exactly, Chernozem soil. And when you combine this agricultural wealth with the mineral resources and the strategic location, well, you start to understand why this region has been at the center of so many conflicts throughout history.
And I'm guessing these resources aren't just sitting there unused. Who's actually taking advantage of all this wealth?
That's where things get really interesting. We're seeing new economic corridors developing, particularly with China's Belt and Road Initiative. They're essentially creating modern versions of the ancient Silk Road, connecting all these resource-rich areas.
So they're basically proving Mackinder, right? Building land-based transportation networks to control these resources?
In a way, yes, but with a modern twist. It's not just about railways anymore. We're talking about pipelines, power grids, fiber optic cables, entire infrastructure networks that create what some people call the new digital Silk Road.
Sounds like Mackinder's theory is actually becoming more relevant, not less.
Absolutely. And here's something that would have blown Mackinder's mind. Some of the most valuable resources in his heartland today aren't things he could have even imagined, like rare earth elements, which are crucial for modern technology.
And I'm guessing these aren't evenly distributed around the world?
Not at all. The Heartland region contains some of the world's largest deposits. And when you consider how essential these elements are for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles to military equipment, well, you can see why control of these resources matters so much in today's world. Now, let's look at how Mackinder's theory is playing out in real-world situations today. The current conflict in Ukraine is probably the most striking example we've seen in decades.
Because Ukraine is part of that Eastern European gateway to the heartland that Mackinder talked about.
Exactly, but there's another fascinating angle to this that's pure 21st century. The European Union is actually having what some analysts call its Mackinder moment.
It's what now?
It's Mackinder moment. The EU is basically reassessing its entire strategic position in relation to the heartland. They're realizing that their economic and security interests are deeply tied to exactly the regions Mackinder highlighted.
So it's not just about military control anymore?
Not at all. Take China's Belt and Road Initiative. It's probably the most ambitious application of heartland theory principles we've seen. But it's using economic rather than military power.
Right. They're building infrastructure instead of sending armies.
And here's what's fascinating. They're creating what you might call new heartlands. Africa, for instance, has become incredibly strategic, with 30% of the world's mineral reserves.
Wait, so the theory is actually expanding beyond its original geographical focus?
Absolutely. The Indo-Pacific region has emerged as another crucial strategic space. It's like we're seeing Mackinder's theory evolve in real time to match our interconnected world.
But surely the digital revolution changes things. I mean, does controlling physical territory matter as much in a world of cloud computing and digital commerce?
That's a really interesting point, and it's actually created a whole new dimension to the theory. Now we're seeing countries trying to control digital infrastructure just as much as physical territory.
Like the competition over 5G networks?
Precisely. And submarine cables, satellite systems, data centers, these are the new strategic assets. But here's the thing. They still largely follow those same geographical patterns Mackinder identified.
So even our digital infrastructure is somehow tied to these traditional power centers?
Yes, and it gets even more interesting when you look at how countries are using these new technologies to enhance their control over traditional territories. Think about China's Digital Silk Road Initiative.
I'm guessing this isn't just about laying fiber optic cables.
Not at all. It's about creating entire digital ecosystems. payment systems, e-commerce platforms, smart city technologies. It's Mackinder's theory adapted for the digital age.
You know what's wild about this? It sounds like his theory is actually becoming more relevant, not less.
That's exactly right, and we're seeing it play out in really unexpected ways. Like how some countries are using technology to assert control over maritime spaces, creating what some call domain awareness.
So they're using high-tech tools to control old-fashioned geographical spaces?
Yes, and it's creating some fascinating new dynamics. For instance, the competition over Arctic resources and shipping routes. That's basically a modern version of the great game that Mackinder was writing about.
With satellites and submarines instead of railways and cavalry?
Exactly. And artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, cyber capabilities, they're all being deployed to control these crucial geographical spaces. It's like Mackinder's theory has gone digital, but the fundamental principles remain the same.
It's amazing how a theory from 1904 can help us understand things like cyber warfare and digital infrastructure.
And that's really the genius of Mackinder's insight. He wasn't just describing the world as it was. He was identifying patterns that would continue to shape global power dynamics, regardless of how technology evolved. You know what's fascinating about how Mackinder's theory has evolved? We're seeing entirely new heartlands emerge that he never could have imagined. Take the semiconductor industry, for example.
That's an interesting angle. Are you suggesting there's a Silicon Heartland?
In a way, yes. Think about Taiwan, which produces 90% of the world's advanced semiconductors. It's become what you might call a technological heartland, absolutely crucial to global power dynamics.
That's quite a shift from Mackinder's focus on Eastern Europe and Central Asia.
Exactly. And there are other emerging heartlands too. The South China Sea has become incredibly strategic, not just for its resources, but because 1/3 out of global shipping passes through it.
So these new heartlands are more about economic choke points than traditional territorial control?
Yes, and here's something even more intriguing. Space is becoming a new type of heartland. Control of satellite orbits, particularly in terms of communications and navigation systems, is becoming as strategically important as controlling physical territory.
Wait, are you saying Mackinder's theory now extends beyond Earth?
In a way, think about it. Whoever controls key satellite orbits and space-based infrastructure has enormous influence over global communications, navigation, and surveillance. It's a whole new dimension of strategic control.
That's mind-bending. But what about closer to home? I've heard people talk about data centers as strategic assets.
Absolutely right. Places like Northern Virginia have become what you might call digital heartlands. They process something like 70% of global internet traffic. That's an enormous concentration of power in one geographical location.
So even in the digital age, physical location still matters?
Precisely. And here's another fascinating development. The Arctic is emerging as a new heartland. As ice melts, we're seeing new shipping routes and resource opportunities opening up.
I've heard about the Northwest Passage becoming navigable. Is that part of this?
Yes, and it's a perfect example of how climate change is literally redrawing the map of strategic regions. Countries that never had Arctic access before are suddenly very interested in these new routes.
It's amazing how many new dimensions there are to this theory. But surely some areas have become less important too?
That's an interesting point. Some traditional strategic locations have actually lost importance, but others have gained new significance for unexpected reasons. Take the African continent.
Because of natural resources?
That's part of it, but it's also about demographic potential. Africa's young population is becoming increasingly important in a world where many traditional powers are aging rapidly.
So human capital is creating new heartlands too?
Exactly. And when you combine that with Africa's renewable energy potential, particularly solar power in the Sahara, you can see why it's becoming strategically crucial in ways Mackinder never imagined.
It's like his theory keeps finding new applications.
And here's what I find most fascinating. These new heartlands are all interconnected. Control of semiconductor production influences space capabilities, which affects digital infrastructure, which impacts economic power.
So instead of one heartland, we're dealing with a network of them?
Yes, and understanding these connections is crucial for modern geopolitics. It's not just about controlling territory anymore. It's about managing these complex interconnections between different types of strategic assets.
Sounds like we need a Mackinder for the 21st century to make sense of it all.
Maybe we do. But what's remarkable is how many of his basic insights about the relationship between geography and power still hold true, even as the nature of that geography changes. You know, for all its brilliant insights, we need to address something important about Mackinder's theory. It has a darker side that's caused quite a bit of controversy over the years.
Oh? What kind of controversy are we talking about?
Well, like many powerful ideas, it's been used to justify some troubling actions. Throughout the 20th century, various powers have used the theory to rationalize territorial expansion and military interventions.
I can see how that could happen if you believe controlling certain regions is crucial for global power. It might seem to justify taking them by force.
Exactly, and this brings up a really uncomfortable aspect of the theory. It can sometimes promote a kind of geographical determinism that ignores human rights and national sovereignty.
Can you give us an example of how this has played out?
Well, Nazi Germany's concept of Lebensraum, their policy of territorial expansion, drew heavily on Mackinder's ideas. They used the theory to justify their aggressive expansion into Eastern Europe.
That's pretty disturbing, but surely that's a misuse of the theory rather than its intended purpose.
True, but it highlights a fundamental problem. When you frame certain territories as naturally destined to be controlled by great powers, you're potentially providing intellectual cover for aggression.
I'm guessing this criticism is still relevant today?
Very much so. Some scholars argue that the theory promotes an overly militaristic view of international relations. They say it reduces complex global interactions to a simple game of territorial control.
Like it's all just a giant game of Risk?
That's actually a great analogy. And here's another criticism. The theory tends to downplay the importance of other forms of power, like soft power, cultural influence, or economic interdependence.
Not to mention things like international law and institutions?
Exactly. Critics argue that the theory is too focused on zero-sum competition. It doesn't account for how countries might benefit from cooperation rather than competition.
But haven't we seen some of these criticisms play out in real time, like with recent conflicts?
Yes, and that's what makes this discussion so relevant. When we see nations today justifying territorial aggression by citing strategic necessity or historical spheres of influence, we're often seeing Mackinder's ideas being misused.
So how do we separate the theory's valuable insights from its potential for misuse?
That's the key question. Many modern scholars suggest we need to update the theory to emphasize cooperation and mutual benefit rather than competition and control.
And I'm guessing this is where those alternative frameworks come in?
Right. There are fascinating new approaches that focus on connectivity rather than control. Instead of asking who rules the Heartland, they ask how we can create networks that benefit everyone.
That sounds more constructive than just fighting over territory.
It is. And here's something really interesting. Some scholars argue that the real power in today's world isn't about controlling territory at all. It's about controlling the rules and standards that govern global interactions.
Like who sets the standards for international banking or internet protocols?
Exactly. This is what some call the new geopolitics of standards, and it suggests that maybe we need to move beyond Mackinder's territorial focus altogether.
Sounds like the theory needs a 21st century update.
Yes, but here's the challenge. How do we retain Mackinder's valuable insights about the importance of geography while avoiding the theory's potential to justify aggression and conflict?
That's quite a balancing act.
It is, and it's one that modern geopolitical thinkers are still wrestling with. Because while we might criticize aspects of Mackinder's theory, we can't deny that geography still matters. We just need to think about it in more nuanced ways. You know, Rowan, what amazes me most about Mackinder's theory is how it keeps finding new relevance. A Victorian geographer somehow gave us a framework that helps explain everything from semiconductor politics to space-based infrastructure.
It's pretty remarkable. Though I'm still trying to wrap my head around how a theory about controlling physical territory applies to things like satellite orbits and digital networks.
That's exactly what makes it so fascinating. The core insight wasn't just about land, it was about understanding how controlling strategic assets, whatever they might be, shapes global power.
And now we're seeing new heartlands emerge that Mackinder never could have imagined.
Right, but here's what I think is most important. While the theory helps us understand power dynamics, we need to be careful about how we apply these insights.
Because of its potential to justify conflict?
Exactly. The real challenge for our generation is figuring out how to use these geographical insights to promote cooperation rather than competition.
So maybe instead of asking who controls the heartland, we should be asking how we can share its benefits.
That's a perfect way to put it. In an interconnected world, maybe the real power comes not from controlling territory, but from building bridges, both literal and metaphorical.
Well, I think Mackinder would be fascinated to see how his theory has evolved.
Indeed, and who knows? 100 years from now, people might be applying his insights to colonies on Mars.
Thanks for listening. If you liked, don't forget to share it with your friends. See you next time.